as you might expect, if you're sort of gathering together all of these different experiences, and you have this sort of common core set, and there seems to be sort of progressions that occur when you really dive into the literature, aside from there being this general non-symbolic category that encompasses, like stasis 5 categories, as an example. If you get into someone like Sri Aurobindo's stuff, there's a lot of gradation that he makes clear in his writings. So one of the things that came out of this was people basically saying, you know what, this is just another stage of human development. So what we're really looking at here is a situation where just like we learn to walk and read and write and deal with our emotions in certain ways, etc., and all of those things sort of move us forward as humans, some people go further. Some people go into these non-symbolic states, and that must be something that we can just basically take and stack on top of our other psychological states. And that's really what we see represented here. So down here we have some very common and very, very well-researched developmental states in human beings. And what we see above that are some of these other types of states sort of tacked on. And what a graphic like this basically implies is that progression. That, okay, I go from sensory motor and eventually I hit formal operations, and then I'm going to make a leap into something called, vision logic, for example. And I'm going to wind up, in these far reaches of enlightenment if I go far enough. You can also see that represented in other ways from a developmental standpoint. So, for instance, here are some of the major groupings that you see sometimes within developmental psychology. And you can see some of, this is a researcher who got his PhD at Harvard University and went on to research with the Maharishi organization. And so this is some of that person's rankings for this, that you start off down trying to deal with the physical world and, behavior senses and desires, and then mind and intellect and ego, and finally, unity consciousness if you make it far enough, right? Another one, this is a bit more rigorously researched academic model. This one is based more on Eastern psychology. This one is based more on Western psychology. And so you see starting with the undifferentiated self and sort of moving up in the complexity of that until eventually you hit something called the transcendent self. Well, there's a couple of problems with these models. One of them is that for this one, at a certain point in the research, it began to become clear that people who were enlightened, or people who were in sort of these non-symbolic states of consciousness and were claiming enlightenment states, didn't actually correspond to some of these higher levels. So that's a pretty major problem with we all make this sort of standard progression, and these non-symbolic states are just a continuation along that progression. But there was, frankly, another problem associated with it. And you can see it in works like Falk's Stripping the Gurus, which is actually available online for free at strippingthegurus.com. And the case that Falk makes is that these people who are holding themselves out as much more developmentally advanced than the rest of us, in fact, have some pretty strange things that they do, some of which seem morally troubling. And so you've got all sorts of, and you can see just from the cover, you can get kind of a hint at that, right? Sex, violence, abuse, and enlightenment. So he goes through and he looks at a lot of the major people who have held themselves out as gurus for our age, quote unquote, as people who are in persistent non-symbolic consciousness and were teaching others, writing about these states. And what is it that their private lives actually looked like? And how did that seem to match these ideas of development, Were they increasing in what we would consider morality? Were they increasing in generosity? Things like that. And this actually led to a very significant shift in the way that these states are viewed. And it was really pioneered by another one of my mentors, and that's someone named Alan Combs. So what began to be noticed was sort of that you have these different developmental dimensions, and someone may be up here in terms of very, very advanced non-symbolic states, but they may be way, way down here in terms of their moral development, or what we would consider their moral development. And this began to be represented in graphics like this one, where people have lots of different ways and lots of different types of internal development. And just because someone is in a persistent state of non-symbolic consciousness, that doesn't actually mean that they're more developed from a moral standpoint or a values standpoint or whatever than others. What it basically means is that they're reporting a certain type of internal experience, that usually it has a tremendous amount of positive emotion associated with it, as an example, that it has that unity experience, that noetic type of experience that goes along with it. But it doesn't mean that they're going to be more moral, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be held up as some sort of moral leader. Well, there's another way to express this, and it's from Alan Combs and also Ken Wilber. And in fact, you see it sort of called the Wilber-Combs lattice, or the Combs-Wilber lattice, or the Wilber-Combs matrix. It sort of depends upon the era of what you're reading and who's writing it. But basically, Ken Wilber claims to have had this idea sort of at the same time that Alan Combs had it. Alan Combs, Ken Wilber, both scholars in this area. Alan is one of really the great scholars in this area. His book, Radiance of Being, is an absolute must-read. And he's just, in fact, come out with a new book that I helped him edit very recently. So anyway, if you want to just take a look at his stuff, it's absolutely fantastic. But what is it showing here? What are we seeing with this matrix or this lattice? Well, the basic idea is that here are some of the developmental stages, right? Now, these developmental stages can be represented in a lot of different ways. One way to think of them is, what's the composite of this? So if you go back to that sort of psychograph idea, you're at level 2 morally, you're at level 3 from a values standpoint, you're at level 6 from a cognitive standpoint, you're at level whatever from some other developmental standpoint. What's the composite of all of those? If you put them all together, you have sort of the totality of your being. And you can sort of represent that somewhere along this line, right? We could say that someone with one combination of those is here, someone with another combination of it is here, someone with another combination of it is here. And what this is saying is basically that if you're here, your experience of these non-symbolic states, and these are incidentally some different ways to experience reality. So here we have a gross state, sort of a normal state is one way to view that, but it can also be viewed as sort of a nature mysticism type thing. But let's just for a moment say that these are gradations of non-symbolic consciousness, right? Which some of them are. Well, certainly some of them can be interpreted that way. Subtle, causal, non-dual. They have some non-symbolic elements there, especially causal and non-dual have non-symbolic elements, but subtle can. So let's just assume for a moment that they all do. And that I'm coming in at a certain point here. Well, that's really my perspective. And if you think about it, well, however I'm experiencing things in terms of the symbolic to non-symbolic continuum, it's going to be affected based on who I am. Who is my morality? Who am I from a moral standpoint? Who am I from a values standpoint? Just because I'm having this unitive experience, it doesn't wipe all that out. So the idea of a lattice or a matrix is that basically you can be having these types of non-symbolic experiences and have your sort of personal psychology be at a lot of different levels. So someone could be here, someone else could be here, someone else could be here, someone else could be here. And the argument is that their experience of the non-symbolic and how they bring it back and report it, how they manifest it in their lives, the example that they set for others, it's all going to relate to sort of where they're at. So if you're very high in your development of morality and values, and you're in a very advanced non-symbolic state, how you write about that experience, how you share that experience with others, how you exemplify that experience for others, it's going to be very different than someone who would score very low in terms of what we think of as at least our Western norms for values or morality, as an example. So when we talk about non-symbolic consciousness and we talk about all the different flavors that are possible of non-symbolic consciousness, this is really what we have to keep in mind. And that's all collapsed down into this portion of the continuum. All of that type of idea is compressed down right into this portion. And really it's expressed across the entire continuum, but it's especially poignant in this area.